Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into a really critical environmental challenge. It's about freshwater fish, but maybe not in the way you first think. It's about how they're moving all over the globe.
Yeah, we're looking at a specific paper today, a 2010 review titled Current Knowledge on Non-Native Freshwater Fish Introductions.
hmm
The lead author is R.E. Gozlan, along with several colleagues. And this isn't just a list of fish. It really tries to get at the why and the how and maybe how we can manage the situation.
Right, and I think the paper's goal is really important, especially now. It's trying to give policymakers some sort of path forward because you've got these huge economic demands, right? Things like fish farming, aquaculture, recreational fishing, massive industries.
Huge money involved.
Exactly. And you have to somehow balance that with the absolute need to protect native fish, the biodiversity that's already there. It's a classic conservation puzzle, really.
And the scale of the problem, it just jumps right out from the first few pages. The authors found the rate that these non-native fish are being introduced around the world actually doubled. Doubled, yeah.
Yeah.
In just 30 years, which is, when you think about it, incredibly fast. It's tied to globalization, people moving, goods moving. Organisms are hitching rides faster than ever before.
So with that kind of speed and scale, you have to ask why. What's driving this massive movement?
Well, the paper's pretty clear on that. The overwhelming driver, the main motivation behind almost all of this, it's economic activity.
Okay, so where's the biggest chunk of that economic drive coming from?
Aquaculture, fish farming. That's the single biggest factor. They identify about 39% of all the intentional introductions. And we're not talking small ponds here. This is global. Think about tilapia, the African cichlid.
Right, you see that everywhere now.
Well, get this. The paper reports that tilapia production is actually 7 times higher in Asia than in its native Africa. That just shows you how massive its introduced range has become, driven by farming.
Wow, 7 times more outside its home than in it.
Uh,
That's quite something.
And it's not just warm water fish either. Take salmon. Think about Chile. They produce something like 30% of the world's farmed salmon.
And that's not native to Chile, is it?
Not at all. It's entirely based on introduced species. So the economic engine behind this is just enormous, and it keeps feeding itself.
Okay, so aquaculture is number one, a huge driver. What's next on the list for intentional introductions?
That would be what they call improvement of wild stocks. That accounts for about 17%. This is often linked to fishing, especially recreational fishing.
Ah, stocking lakes and rivers for anglers.
Precisely. And recreational fishing is serious business. Across Europe, for instance, the annual spending is over 25 billion euros. To keep anglers happy, fisheries are constantly stocked, often with non-native favorites like rainbow trout or largemouth bass.
So those are the big economic reasons, food and fun, essentially. But the paper mentions other pathways, too, some that seem a bit, well, maybe less profit-driven, like biocontrol. That was 6%.
Yeah, biocontrol is interesting. That's where humans intentionally introduce a species to try and control another unwanted species. The classic examples are mosquito fish Gambusia brought in to eat mosquito larvae.
Does it work?
Sometimes, maybe. But the paper points out the success is pretty mixed, honestly. And sometimes the introduced species causes its own problems, like grass carp brought in to eat aquatic weeds, but they often end up messing up the whole ecosystem, maybe hurting native fish more than they help with the weeds. You solve one problem, maybe create another.
Right. And then we move from the intentional stuff, even the well-intentioned stuff like biocontrol, to the purely accidental introductions. That's almost 8%.
Yes, and these are tricky, because often they're linked back to those big intentional pathways. A major cause is fish escaping from aquaculture facilities, just, getting out.
Makes sense. If you farm millions of fish, some are bound to escape.
Exactly. But there are other ways too. Ballast water in ships is a big one. That's how species like the rough and the round goby likely got into the Great Lakes in North America, just dumped out with the water.
And the paper highlights another accidental route I found fascinating, the sort of hitchhiker effect. Contaminants in shipments?
Oh, that's a real headache. The topmouth gudgeon is the poster child for this, Pseudoras boroparva. It apparently spread right across Europe because it was accidentally included in shipments of Chinese carps being imported for aquaculture.
So you order carp, then you get this little extra fish you didn't ask for.
Pretty much. And this tiny gudgeon then takes off, spreads everywhere, and as we'll probably discuss later, can carry some nasty diseases. It's a perfect example of how even a small contamination can have huge, unexpected consequences.
Okay, so we have a pretty good picture of the pathways now intentional for profit or perceived benefit, and accidental through escapes or contamination. Now, the really tough part. Once these fish arrive, how do we figure out if they're actually causing harm? This seems to be a major focus of the Gozlan Review, right? Refining ecological impact.
Absolutely. And it's so important because, as the paper notes, fish are one of the most introduced groups of animals worldwide, something like 624 species documented as non-native back then. But they're also one of the most threatened groups. So the whole discussion around impact gets very heated, very polarized in the scientific community.
So terminology matters here. We need to be clear what we mean by non-native.
We do. And the paper adopts the standard ecological definition, the one used by the IUCN, the Convention on Biological Diversity. It means a species introduced outside its natural range. Doesn't matter if it crossed a country border or just moved to a different river basin where it didn't live before. It's about the biology, not the politics.
Got it. And traditionally, scientists looked at specific negative effects, right?
Yeah, a standard list. Predation eating native species,
Mm.
competition fighting for food or space, hybridization breeding with native relatives and diluting their genes, habitat degradation messing up the physical environment, and spreading diseases.
The five horsemen of invasion ecology, basically.
Something like that. But the key argument in this paper is that just ticking off those boxes, looking at those effects one by one, often isn't enough to really understand the overall impact. They argue for a more nuanced view.
Okay, so what's the nuance? What's the big insight here for how we should assess harm?
This is probably the core policy recommendation. They propose a critical threshold. They argue that an ecological impact should only really be labeled harmful in a way that warrants serious management intervention if the changes it causes lead to a quantifiable and significant decline in biological or genetic diversity.
So not just any change, but a change that actually threatens the long-term survival or integrity of native species or populations.
Precisely. Change is almost inevitable when you introduce something new. But they're saying we need to focus on measurable, significant loss. Is the introduction pushing native species towards decline or local extinction? If not, maybe it doesn't meet that high bar for harmful impact in a policy sense.
That's a really important distinction. Can you give an example of a species that does clearly cross that threshold, according to the paper?
The common carp, Cyprinus carpio, is a classic example they discuss. They're often called ecosystem engineers.
Because they physically change the environment.
Exactly. Their feeding behavior, rooting around in the bottom sediments for food, stirs everything up. It rips out aquatic plants, makes the water cloudy or turbid.
Which blocks sunlight, right. So other plants can't grow back easily.
Right, and that turbidity affects everything, the insects, the plankton, the other fish that rely on clear water or plants. So the carp isn't just competing, it's fundamentally altering the physical and biological structure of the ecosystem. That kind of large-scale, persistent habitat change definitely meets their test for significant harmful impact.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a systemic change. Now, let's switch back to the economics for a second. We talked about the drivers, but what about the outcomes? Is it always a net negative economically when a non-native fish arrives?
That's a common assumption, but the paper challenges it. It's more complex. On the one hand, yes, there can be huge costs, which we'll get to, but you can't ignore the benefits. Non-native species globally make up something like 17% of the world's finfish production from aquaculture and fisheries.
So nearly a fifth of the fish we eat or catch comes from species living outside their native range.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Think back to that farmed salmon in Chile or tilapia farmed across Asia. And in the U.S., for example, sport fishing, much of which targets introduced species like bass or trout, is estimated to contribute around $69 billion a year to the economy. That's not insignificant.
69 billion. Okay, that's a huge number, but there's always a but, isn't there? What about the costs?
Oh, the costs can be absolutely massive and ongoing. The textbook case study is the sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. It's an invasive parasite that latches onto valuable fish like trout and salmon.
Nasty things.
Very. And to control them, just to keep the populations down enough to protect the fishery, which itself generates maybe $4 billion annually, the U.S. and Canada spend around $10 million every year just on lamprey control and research. Plus another $10 million on stocking fish to replace the ones the lamprey kill or to bolster the fishery.
So $20 million a year indefinitely just to manage one invasive species in one region.
That's the reality. It shows how incredibly expensive mitigation can be once a problematic species gets established. Prevention is almost always cheaper.
Which leads perfectly into the next question. How do we prevent the next sea lamprey? How do we stop these high-impact species before they become multi-million-dollar problems?
This is where risk assessment comes in. The paper emphasizes the need for better tools to screen species before they're introduced. They talk about tools like FISC, the Fish Invasiveness Scoring Kit.
FIS, what does that involve?
It's basically a checklist. A potential introduction, say, a fish species someone wants to import for aquaculture or stocking, is scored against a list of about 49 different biological and ecological traits. Things like its reproductive rate, diet, tolerance to different conditions, history of invasiveness elsewhere.
And that gives you a score predicting its likelihood of becoming invasive in the new environment.
That's the idea. It's a quantitative way to try and flag the high-risk species beforehand. Though the paper acknowledges these tools aren't foolproof, they're not 100% reliable.
Which brings us back to that philosophical debate in conservation, doesn't it? The sort of guilty until proven innocent approach that some scientists advocate, assuming any introduction is potentially harmful unless proven otherwise.
Yes, that precautionary principle is very common in invasion biology. The idea is that the risks are potentially so high and the impact so hard to reverse that you should err on the side of extreme caution.
But the Gozlan paper offers a different perspective here based on their findings. Something about a tens rule.
Right. They say the TENS rule, a general observation in invasion biology, that roughly 10% of introduced species establish, and 10% of those become pests. But their analysis of fish introductions suggests something even more specific and maybe controversial. They estimate that only about 1% of all non-native fish species introduced globally actually end up being associated with serious ecological impacts.
Wait, just 1%? That seems really low, especially given all the horror stories we hear. Does that figure hold up? How do they justify it?
Well, it's based on their review of the documented impacts across hundreds of introductions. Their argument is that while many introduced species might cause some changes, the really damaging ones, the ones causing significant biodiversity loss, like the carp example, are actually quite rare.
And the implication that 1% figure is?
It suggests that maybe the blanket all introductions are bad approach is too broad. If only 1% cause serious harm, then perhaps we can get better at discriminating between the high-risk species and the relatively benign ones. It opens the door for more targeted regulation rather than outright bans on everything. It's crucial for policymakers juggling those economic versus ecological pressures.
Okay, that really does shift the perspective. So, if we can potentially discriminate, what happens when a species is already established and is causing problems? What are the options then?
Well, once prevention has failed, you're looking at management. The paper outlines two main strategies. The first is remediation, trying to completely eradicate the species from the area.
Is that even possible with fish?
Sometimes, in very specific situations. Usually it involves using biocides like rotenone, a fish poison, but it typically only works in small, contained water bodies like ponds or isolated lake sections. It's expensive, technically difficult, and raises big ethical questions about killing everything else in the water too, all the native fish and invertebrates.
Right, the collateral damage. So eradication is tough. What's the alternative?
Mitigation. This means accepting the species is probably there to stay, but trying to control its numbers or limit its negative effects. Containment and suppression, basically.
And the paper mentions some interesting techniques here, like electric barriers.
Yeah, things like electric barriers, bubble curtains, or even underwater sound, hydroacoustic barriers, have been used to try and block the movement of invasive fish, like keeping invasive carp out of new areas. And there are more targeted approaches, too, like using pheromones.
Pheromones, like chemical signals.
Exactly. They've had some success using pheromones to trap sea lampreys, for example, by luring them into traps or disrupting their spawning behavior. The idea is to find a biological weak spot you can exploit, rather than just trying to poison everything. It's about managing the impact, not necessarily eliminating the fish entirely.
Okay, so prevention first, then maybe targeted mitigation if needed. But looking ahead, the review flags one particular risk as maybe the biggest future threat. What was that?
It's the introduction of non-native infectious agents, diseases, parasites. The paper strongly suggests that aquaculture, because it moves so many fish around and often keeps them in high densities, acts as a major pathway, not just for the fish themselves, but for their pathogens.
And the example that really stands out here is that topmouth gudgeon again.
Right.
But not because of what it does directly.
Precisely. The gudgeon itself might compete a bit, but the real danger is that it's often a healthy carrier of a nasty microparasite called Sphaerothecum destruens, sometimes called the rosette agent.
And this parasite affects other fish.
Critically, yes. and it seems to be non-species specific. It's been linked to serious declines in native European fish, like the sunbleak. So you have this introduced fish, the gudgeon, swimming around perfectly healthy, but shedding this parasite that then infects and kills vulnerable native species.
That's a nightmare scenario. A silent carrier spreading a deadly disease through the trade networks.
It really is. And because the carrier looks fine, an infected native fish might just get weak and eaten quickly by predators, the connection can be easily missed. The authors really stress that monitoring and managing disease emergence linked to aquaculture and fish movements needs to be a top priority going forward. It's potentially the most insidious threat.
So, pulling it all together, we have these complex pathways, significant economic benefits from some introductions, huge potential costs from others, and this lurking threat of disease. Where does that leave us in terms of managing the whole situation? What's the way forward?
Well, the paper concludes it's what they call a neo-paradox. You have these competing valid concerns. The authors argue that aiming for absolute zero risk, stopping all introductions, is probably unrealistic and maybe even counterproductive, especially given that 1% finding about serious impacts.
Because the economic drivers are just too strong, and maybe not all introductions are equally bad.
Right. So the pragmatic solution proposed by Gozlan and his colleagues is really about smarter regulation. They advocate for strengthening international rules, but basing them on those risk assessment tools, like FISC. And crucially, combining the ecological risk score of a species with its potential economic value.
So, trying to find the sweet spot. Species that offer significant economic benefits but pose a relatively low risk to biodiversity.
Exactly. Identify those low-risk, high-reward candidates. The paper mentions species like sterlet sturgeon or coho salmon as potential examples that might fit this category in certain contexts. The idea is to allow for market diversification and economic activity where the ecological gamble seems reasonably safe based on evidence, rather than just applying blanket bans. It's about informed discrimination.
Acknowledging the trade-offs, basically. So, if you were to point to one key takeaway or next step from this review for people working in conservation or policy today, what would it be?
I think the most forward-looking idea they touch on is the need to create better maps of potential conservation hotspots. Not just mapping where invasive species are now, but predicting where future introductions are most likely to happen.
How would you do that?
By combining data. Look at predictors of introduction pressure. Things like human population density, proximity to major ports, intensity of aquaculture activity. Then overlay that with maps of biodiversity vulnerability areas with high numbers of unique or threatened native species, especially endemic ones found nowhere else.
So you identify where the risk of introduction meets the highest potential for ecological loss.
Precisely. That kind of proactive mapping could help prioritize prevention efforts, surveillance, and rapid response actions in the places that are most vulnerable to the next potentially damaging introduction, focusing resources where they likely matter most.
That's a really powerful idea. So something for you, the listener, to think about. It's not just about the fish we see, but about anticipating where the next wave might hit and which native communities are most at risk. A fascinating, complex, and ongoing challenge.